Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith. A proposal for election transparency has one state legislator going against the Department of State. At the center of the split, changes made to Pennsylvania's elections stemming from the passage of Act 77 of 2019, which is the law that expanded mail-in voting quite dramatically in Pennsylvania. Representative Roae from Meadville introduced a plan to require the department to again update precinct counts online, which would allow voters to see how the count is progressing. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Anthony Hennon. Anthony, tell me about this bill, and it seems like it's going back to something that the state used to do. So what's the history here?
Yeah, so it seems like something straightforward and simple. Roae is promoting this as an effort for election transparency. Before Act 77 was passed, and passed, mind you, in a bipartisan form, which many have come to regret, with no mail-in ballots, Department of State would update vote counts online, and they would have a precinct counter, which basically showing how many votes are still out there. You would see how many votes have been counted at a precinct and have a rough estimate of, whether that's 20%, 50%, 80%. So you have a general idea of when the final vote count would be coming in. You can kind of adjust to that. With the bringing about of Act 77, that practice has ended. The Department of State does not anymore update precinct counts on the website. And so Roy is arguing that, we need to go back to how it was. He argues that the Department of State still gets this information, but they removed it from their website so that citizens can no longer see it. And he called changing this a common sense piece of legislation. There's less transparency, and I'm trying to fix it. So, that seems fairly straightforward here, what he's trying to do. What's complicated is Act 77. Basically, with the advent of mail ballots, those ballots are not counted on the precinct level anymore. They come in, they're tracked, at a county level, but you don't know if this is being done voted at the local school, maybe down the road somewhere. So the Department of State does not reveal the precinct counters anymore because they argue that it's misleading. The Department of State Press Secretary Matt Heckel said this information no longer accurately reflected the progress of total vote counting, and so was removed prior to the 2020 general election. This is because mail ballots are counted by county boards of elections, not by precincts. Displaying only the number of precincts reporting returns will not capture the true progress of canvassing and counting both in-person and mail ballots. So basically, if we would put up the precinct numbers, it may look like we're getting all those votes counted, but only because votes that previously would have been cast in a precinct are getting mailed in. So the Department of State is worried of if they put this up, then this is going to give the public a false impression. It might look inaccurate. Things might look like they're being changed at last moment for no reason, and it would cause a lot of headaches.
Yeah, and you can understand why this would tie into election security. I think for some of our listeners, to put this in a more straightforward context, I think we're all familiar with on election night, you'll see Fox News and other big news organizations calling states for specific candidates. Or I know famously on Fox News, they will pull up a state and they'll go by precinct and they'll be able to say, this precinct's in, and this is the direction it went. And so that data is really used to help call states for the election. It's unclear what the AP does, but because they kind of have this proprietary formula that they follow, but presumptively precinct counts are in there. So if you take that away, it really does make it unclear which way Pennsylvania is leaning. And I think that everyone in this state is aware of that in the last couple of elections, because instead of being able to understand where our state was going to wind up, perhaps, early in the morning of the day following the election. But now we're having to wait for mail-in ballots because of how close it's been. I mean, it's days later till we know what's happened. So are they basically just not giving up, but saying we can't, there's no real solution to this. There's no going back to precinct counting.
So basically it seems, they do a supplemental report online that updates once a day that counts in-person ballots along with absentee and mail ballots as kind of the closest proxy that they feel is accurate enough to share with the public. But this goes back to two things. One is the details of Act 77 and how it changed voting. Pennsylvania, unlike a lot of other states, red and blue, does not allow county boards of elections to start counting mail ballots or prepping ballots to be counted until 7 a.m. of election day. You'll see in other states this might start days ahead of time, basically of making sure going through mail-in ballots, removing secrecy envelopes, getting them prepared to run through vote counters. If other states that do this prior to 7 a.m. of the election, they generally have results much faster. I mean, you look at Florida, it's kind of a famous example of this because their elections were so screwy in previous years. They've gotten very good at counting this quickly, counting this clearly, all that fun stuff. The second part of this is the Department of State, its election crew is pretty bare bones, which people don't quite realize. Pennsylvania is very decentralized for its elections. County boards handle most of this. I mean, the Department of State has, I think, something like maybe 24, give or take, full-time employees dealing with elections. Philadelphia County alone has something like, I think, 5 or 6 times that number. So it's very much, this is done at the county level, and counties get a lot of discretion on how to run elections. And so we've seen this in previous years where some counties set up drop boxes, other counties didn't. There's a controversy in Washington County right now, outside of Pittsburgh, where county commissioners decided not to notify voters if their mail-in ballot had an issue. And a court just ruled that they do have to actually notify voters if there is a problem, so voters can come and try to fix it or cast an absentee ballot. So basically what this means is we have counties doing things differently, and they're authorized to do these things differently, but we don't have a lot of uniformity, and we don't have a lot of state-level funding coming in for this. So Pennsylvania is in a bit of a unique position here, and this causes a lot of different headaches. And it is kind of a situation where no one expected mail-in ballot to take off when this law was passed back in 2019. When this was debated, this wasn't really on the radar. And we've had an impasse at fixing some of these problems due to divides over things like pushing through real ID to make sure that people are showing some form of identification when they vote. That's been a very controversial thing among Democrats. We've seen some polls where the general public doesn't mind it, but that's something that Democrats have not necessarily been willing to work with Republicans on. On the flip side, Republicans are much more wary of expanding mail-in ballots, of things like drop boxes due to concerns over election security. So we're kind of at a point where Pennsylvania is getting almost the worst of all possible worlds here. It's very decentralized. Some things are allowed, some things aren't. There's not a lot of uniformity across the state. And so this is a situation we're in. So when we're talking about things like election transparency, there's a lot of different parts to this. Roae is not out here declaring every election as a fraud or anything like this. But, it seems very clear. It'd be great if we could have some real-time updates on where votes are going, how many are counted, when we'll actually get a result. But the complexity, the convolutedness, the decentralized nature of Pennsylvania elections, all of that's really keeping us from getting a clear, quick, and easy to understand vote counter, election system, simple balloting process here in the Commonwealth.
Anthony, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.